let's just get started. So really warm welcome again. So as I said, my name is Marika. I work at UnLtd, and as I know, I can recognize some of the names of people who've joined in. So some of you would have been listening to webinars before, but those of you who haven't, we've been running a webinar series now for probably about 18 months. And are really pleased to welcome new hosts to share their expertise and their knowledge with you in this way. Today, I'm particularly pleased to introduce you to Dan Berello. Oh my God, Dan, I'm so sorry. I was so concerned about pronouncing your surname that I am now just not getting it right. Berelovich.
That's good enough.
Brilliant. From the International Center for Social Franchising. Dan is the CEO and the co-founder of the center, which was founded in 2011. We quite regularly get asked questions around social franchising, just generally for people wanting to understand what it is. And then just that question of when is it appropriate for a social entrepreneur to consider that as their option for scaling up. You know, when is an entrepreneur ready? And I particularly like the question, what does ready look like? You know, and I'm sure there's no one size fit all answer, but those are some of the things that Dan will be exploring with us. Dan will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after that. So those of you for whom this is your first webinar, you will notice a chat function at the end, at the bottom of your dashboard. So please use that to type in any questions you have for Dan. And then what we'll do is at the end, we'll cover those, I'll read those out, and we'll answer as many as we can. So please use the chat. Also, if you've got problems, if you can't hear, etc., or problems with I don't know, with seeing the screen or something, you can also type in hopefully any of that through the chat, and then I can pick those up on the background. That's all from me. I'll hand you over to Dan and let him introduce himself properly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marika. That's great. So today I'm going to be giving you an introduction to social franchising. The name is Dan Berelovich, and I founded the center, as Marika says, 3 years ago. So my journey started actually running an NGO, and you can see here 3 projects that we supported in India, each one making baskets. Now, the charity I started still exists and is doing well, which is great, and we did well financially, but I started getting incredibly frustrated with just this. I saw examples of very similar projects doing great things, but to individuals, and the thing that really started to bother me was how do we take these great examples of best practice and do something on a much larger scale? I was finding ourselves really funding people reinventing the wheel and making mistakes rather than, you know, building on what works. The first project I came across that got me really interested in the idea of franchising was the Trussell Trust. Some of you will have probably heard of them. They run food banks across the UK. So what interested me was that they'd scaled up quite rapidly at the point that I went to visit them, and they'd done it quite quickly through an interesting model. What happened with Food Bank is that around sort of the early 2000s, the people who ran it noticed for the first time that in Salisbury, which is traditionally quite a wealthy part of the country, there were people going hungry. So they did something which I think is probably not particularly innovative, but much needed, which was set up a shed in their back garden and start handing out food to those who really needed it. So as I say, that wasn't particularly innovative. When it started to get interesting was when they decided to actually box up that initiative and really try and understand quite carefully what all the different elements that needed to be part of that box were. Now, they were lucky at this point. A guy called Jeremy Raven who I worked with on some research. Jeremy was in the British Army. He was, very, as you can imagine, sort of systems and process orientated, and actually spent a few years in McKinsey just before he retired. McKinsey, the management consultancy, so a bright guy. And he said his retirement, he wanted to put something back, and took a job at the Trussell Trust. So he applied all his systems and processes thinking to the food bank model. And he spent a couple of years really creating this Trussel Trust food bank in a box. So in the box, and we'll discuss later what goes in the box generally, but for Jeremy it was everything someone would need to take to set up a food bank in their own community. So the systems, the processes, training, etc. Now, what was interesting is that this was sort of happening around 2005, 2006, and they've got to about 40 food banks using a variation of a franchising model. Now, 2007 was a key moment in time. Obviously, the crash globally, and a lot more people are going hungry. And what happened is that churches, and this is the church-based project, started contacting Jeremy and saying, look, we know there's a problem in our community. We've heard you're doing great stuff. We want to set this up. Jeremy, because of all the work he'd done systemizing, was in this pretty unique position at that point to say, here's the box, open up the box, and it has everything you need to run a food bank inside it. And it meant that food bank was able to scale exponentially, from the 40 to 100 to 250, and I believe they're over 450 now, although it's always quite difficult to keep tabs on them, they're growing so quickly. And you might have noticed with these Trussell Trusts all over the country that while Trussell Trust headquarters is still quite small, based in Salisbury, they get a huge amount of publicity. In Duncan Smith, I think is probably not one of their best friends, or hasn't been traditionally over the last few months. They get MPs, they get ministers come and visiting the Trussell Trust, even though actually this is a franchise, so they're not running the food banks across the whole country. They're just boxing up best practice and sharing it. So Trussell Trust, as I say, was the first time I got really excited by the franchising model. And then I started to spot this happening all over the world. In India, with Childline, which also has a branch in the UK, and across Africa as well, with various health programs. And as part of the CLAW Social Leadership Program, which is sort of like a 2-year, I suppose, MBA for the social sector, I was able to really think quite deeply about the different mechanisms for scale, and got just excited in this idea of, call it franchising, but really let's free ourselves from the word franchising and consider it, how do you take something that is working, it's tried and tested in one location, do you take it and do you move it to another location, in a geographic location, and maintain the quality and all the good things about it. So as part of CLAW, I spent a few months at Oxfam, which was fascinating, and through that started getting asked essentially to help. Can you help scale up and think how to franchise? And it was around that time I met my co-founder, Michael Norton, and we decided, rather than set up another social enterprise, the thing to do would be to set up a social enterprise that helped others to franchise and scale. And that's really what we've been doing. So the ICSF, International Centre for Social Franchising, the vision is to spread these great solutions that are working to match the size of the problems they seek to address. We're really about replication rather than franchising only, although franchising I still think is probably the most exciting of all mechanisms for scale, or at least underused. And I'll talk more about the spectrum of replication models in a bit. And then we've set a clear impact goal. So we aim to assist 10 organizations in the first 4 years. We're working with a lot more than that, but really as a registered charity in the UK, we're aiming to work with proven social solutions and scale them in a way that they wouldn't have been able to be scaled otherwise. and that's going well. I'll use a few case studies of the partners we've been working with throughout this presentation. Now, I presume, Marika, that if anything isn't clear, someone can ask a question and you'll interrupt me. Please do that, because at the moment I'm happy just to keep going.
Sure, thanks, Dan. I'm checking the questions. So anyone, if you want to put through questions throughout the webinar, then please do. And if you're happy, then I will then interrupt you and we can ask those. Or alternatively, we do it all at the end. So yeah, I'm here.
Great, thank you. So it's really just if there's clarifications. Okay, so let's talk about the spectrum of social replication models. So when I founded ICSF, our focus really was franchising. But of course, franchising is just one way of scaling up your venture, and there's a whole spectrum. And what I discovered very quickly was that really saying how do we fit franchising to this model is not the right question to ask. The right way to look at it is what is the problem and the solution we've got, and what is the best mechanism for achieving scale. And therefore we've expanded and really look across the spectrum of replication models. And I think it's quite helpful just to be able to position franchising and others within this and to think about where your organization might fit. So Trussell Trust, as I explained, is a boxed up solution. Other churches, when they run it, have to sign some sort of memorandum of understanding and facilitate that model in a fairly controlled way. Trussell Trust, the centre, makes sure that they're on top of the quality, and they've got a system for doing that. So that's the franchising side of things. If we look further down on the dissemination end, an example which I love is Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd imagine some of you will know the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step process better than others. AA, a guy called Bill Wilson, around 1930, came up with these 12 self-help steps to recover from being an alcoholic, which have now since been applied to all sorts of different walks of life. So Bill was interesting because he wrote this little black book, The 12 Steps, sold it for $1. But it started to become very, very successful, and the core of it is that you sit alongside a partner, a buddy, and together you work through the steps, and of course then there are group sessions as well. What Bill Wilson did that was interesting, that's quite unusual for a founder, is he let go. So what he recognized is that actually if me and a friend sit down next to each other and find it useful to go through the 12 steps together, actually he doesn't really need to monitor the quality of that relationship because we're both signing up for it with our eyes open, we're both sort of consenting adults, there's no problem in doing that. So he started getting calls from South America, from the UK, saying, please can we use the model? And Bill just took a step back and said, yes, take it, run with it, and do whatever you want with it. So you can see that that model is looser than Trussell Trust, which requires some sort of memorandum of understanding and quality. And what that meant is that Alcoholics Anonymous was able to spread very, very rapidly globally in a way that other social franchises or more wholly owned ventures will find challenging in terms of implementation. I mean, just another example around that would be a Stop AIDS campaign. So Stop AIDS started in California, and really at the point when Stop AIDS was created, there was a few guys who'd worked out how to get it going in California. They had the little red ribbons they designed, and when people from around the world contacted them, they just sent them a bunch of paper explaining the work they'd done, and other people could interpret it in their own communities. So that also sort of went out very virally, and technology has enabled that as well. So up on the other end of the spectrum, you've got organizations like the NSPCC and of course many others. So we're working with NSPCC at the moment actually on a social franchising project to scale up a perinatal program for disadvantaged women. That's a franchise, that's one of their programs, but as an organization, NSPCC is complex, they do a lot of different work, they do campaigning, and it just doesn't make sense to franchise. Franchising is normally a more simple solution, and so they wholly own. You know, these guys own the different offices in the different locations and have staff members there. So you can start to see then the spectrum of replication from dissemination through to wholly owned. You know, social franchising in the centre. I think people know probably naturally more around dissemination and or owning completely, and therefore people think, oh, franchising, you know, licensing. In fact, licensing is a more simple version of franchising. It's for things like, say, software. You know, your Microsoft Office is a license. You can use it in whatever way you want, whereas franchising is a bit more tightly controlled. So I think people naturally feel like, okay, I fit, you know, maybe it's not dissemination, maybe it's not wholly owned, there's a middle ground. And I think that's right. I think it's very exciting, the potential that social franchising brings. But I think what we found is that people underestimate the amount of work and energy that needs to go into creating that relationship between yourself and your franchisee up front to make sure that the relationship is off on the right foot from the beginning. And people will just set it up quite quickly, and then, of course, things go wrong. So some of the things I'm covering today are going to be about how to avoid those pitfalls, and also the sort of how to work. You know, in the last 3 years we've done that we believe needs to be done before you set up your franchise. Okay, so let's dive into social franchising specifically. Social franchises need a few things if they're to work successfully, and at ICSF we've broken these down into 4 categories. So the first, it makes an acrostic of open, actually. Open, if you open your franchise box, what do you get? So the first is ownership. So the first important thing you need is documents, you know, either legal agreements, or if it's a more dissemination type model or loose model, some kind of memorandum of understanding between you and your franchisees. The second is processes and systems. So let's take Food Bank for an example. They have this fantastic flow diagram which shows exactly how a franchisee needs to, first of all, communicate with a you know, local head of their Sainsbury's, director of their local Sainsbury's supermarket, how they pick up the food and how they transport that back to the food bank, how they weigh it and make sure that they have, you know, the right amount of stock. So that process and systems can take some time, actually, and it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string, depending on how complex your model is. We've seen anything from the School for Social Entrepreneurs, which some of you may know, which does training for entrepreneurs, is based in London but also has 12 franchises around the country. You know, they have a manual, and most of this is systemized in an operating manual. Their manual is about sort of 20 pages long, whereas when I did some research with McDonald's and had an opportunity to read their manual, we're talking more like 600 pages long. So this can vary, and it can take quite a significant amount of time to put that manual together. Third thing you need, the E, is enhanced support network. And actually, I think this is where some of the huge value of being a franchise comes from. Most people, when they're designing their franchise, look at it first of all from their perspective. And that's really the wrong way to look at things. The most important thing is to look at this from the franchisee perspective first. You know, put yourself in their shoes. Would anyone who is half sane embark upon this journey of becoming a franchisee? And the enhanced support network is part of supporting the franchisee to be part of the network. The reason that's so important is that A, if they're not supported, they'll leave. But B, you know, in year 1 and 2, it's actually quite easy to add value to your franchisee because they've never run, you know, the food bank before. You can tell them all about these new things. Now, in year 2 or 3, for the first time, they know, or certainly believe they know, probably more about running a food bank than you. So why should they become a franchisee and potentially still pay you a fee or something along those lines, when in actual fact they believe they could do it on their own? Well, a huge thing that ties us together is the support network, the ability to speak to others in a similar situation and also get the innovation from across the network and bring that into the network. And I think that ties in neatly to point 4, which is the name or the brand. The other reason that your franchisees will stay is because a recognized brand can do great things. You know, if it's a product, if it's a McDonald's, they can sell more hamburgers. I know that the last time I checked 2 years ago, just by having the golden arches on a restaurant, they would bring in £900,000 more turnover a year to each restaurant. So we mustn't underestimate the power of the brand. And I think the brand in the social sector with something like Trussell Trust, you know, will work in a slightly different way. Probably the clients coming in may not care if it's a Trussell Trust or otherwise, but certainly with donors and government, you know, the brand is important, and it means that they're able to do more advocacy work and potentially raise more funding if that's what they need. Okay, let's move on to the opportunity. So first of all, a huge opportunity in franchising is to, of course, stop reinvention of the wheel. We're all, I think, guilty of this. I know I am, of doing something, you know, not making a note of how I do it, you know, did it the year before, and then, you know, ending up with a bit of a mess or doing it all over again. So the real power is in the systemization of ideas. Secondly, I think sharing the financial burden is really interesting for the social sector. So let's take Food Bank again. So Food Bank charge a fee, an annual fee, but it is necessary for each of their franchisees across the country to raise a small sum of money to keep their local food bank going. What this means is that they're really sharing the burden of running a network. So they would, if they had 400 food banks across the UK, even if they're raising just £1,000 a year for each food bank, you know, that's already, you know, £400,000. That's already a significant amount of money. And to be honest, it's more than that. So you can rely on your network to do more of the raising of money. Now, if you're more of a social enterprise, more of a sort of classic for-profit business model, one of the main reasons for franchising is also to share the financial burden. And an example here is the Body Shop. So when the Body Shop first set up, there was that dynamic founder whose name escapes me. Anyway, she was onto something amazing. She was just essentially able to sell these products to anyone who wanted them. As soon as she put the products up, they were the first ethical brand. And people started coming to her and saying, hey, I want to set up a shop in Oxford, in Glasgow. I want to buy your products and I want to understand how to set up the shop, but I'll pay for it all. So she didn't realize, but essentially she was franchising. And she didn't have the money to set up those shops, so she was using the income of franchisees and the risk, asking them to take on the risk of setting up their franchisees to make this scale up more quickly. And that works for sort of the Starbucks of the world as well. By franchising, you can scale up more quickly and sort of dominate a market more quickly. New market opportunities are really important. The School for Social Entrepreneurs, I think, is a wonderful example. You know, when they were just based in London and were training up a few people, nobody was that interested in their methodology, their powerful methodology. However, now they have national coverage, they're able to speak to government and others in a different way. And I think the fact that they've just managed to raise 14 million from Lloyd's and Big Lottery, they clearly wouldn't have been able to do that without having national coverage. So through scale, there are a whole variety of new market opportunities. Activate volunteers. You may or may not use volunteers, but in Food Bank's case, you know, volunteers require people being very close to them and local and really caring at a local level. Food Bank has sort of 70 or 80 volunteers for each of the franchisees. And it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to coordinate that from the center. Big data. I'm not sure if this is a term you've come across before, but data is really, really powerful and quite difficult to gather in the social sector. And what, for example, Food Bank does is they have a standard system for all their franchisees to enter their data into. So they know, for example, the top 2 reasons why people are visiting their food banks for food, and they get that in real time back from the franchisees. So they're actually getting a huge amount of data on food poverty, so much so that they know more about food poverty than the UK government. Now, this gives huge opportunities in terms of campaigning, and I think one of the key things around the franchise is really knowing, what is the issue you're trying to crack. Of course, franchising can help with the implementation side, but the data can help with your campaigning and your advocacy around whatever issue you're dealing with. Gaining political capital, I think that feeds from the last point that we talked about already in terms of food banks, speaking to MPs and others. And finally, and of course most importantly, we're all out to solve a social problem on a large scale, and franchising is just a different way, an interesting way to do that. Okay, so now let's go on to the how. I'm going to use the example of Tender. We're just working with Tender at the moment. Tender are an arts charity who act to end abuse, and they do it through creating healthy relationships with young people across the UK and using drama to do that. So when you're thinking about the how and how you franchise, it's not a linear process normally. So what I'm going to tell you now is the 5 steps if you're doing things step by step. I'm sure you'll have done some systemization. The chances are you've even piloted, you might have 1 or 2 replications. The idea of this is to say, okay, here is the sort of ideal way step by step to replicate and franchise your project. And then let's look for the gaps, the black holes, and fill them up. So the first step is prove. When you aim to prove your project, it's about validating the business model and validating the social impact. We have a replication readiness test, which you'll find on our website in the resources section. So I'd recommend having a go at that. I'll offer at the end as well, but this is the sort of thing I'm happy to have a quick conversation to see whether you're in the right place. But for things like this, and with someone like Tender, Tender have been doing this for a few years already. They're sure that the intervention works in the form they have it at the moment. They've got some monitoring and evaluation already to show positive social impact. So we felt really comfortable saying to them, yes, it's proven, in inverted commas, at least proven enough to start to replicate. And that allows us to move on to the design phase. So design is really, I suppose, developing a business plan that's specifically around scale up. This usually ends up as a sort of 50, 60-page document which covers all the different areas from objectives right through to SWOT analysis and expansion strategy. When we do this for people, it takes around 15 to 20 days, but obviously we do this a lot. So if you were to do this yourself, you could use the resources on our site and others, but expect to put aside a decent amount of time to do a good design phase. Systemize is phase 3, and really once you know the design works and you've got a good business plan, you're ready to systemize, and that's where you codify your operations. You do what Food Bank did, create those operating manuals. You're creating things like a prospectus to advertise the franchise opportunity, and marketing materials and things like that. Once you've systemized, you're ready to pilot. We'd recommend bringing on at least 3 pilot franchisees. That gives you, enough of a spread if, say, one doesn't work for reasons outside your control, and then to do ongoing monitoring and evaluation. If you've never replicated before, maybe just start with 1, whereas if you've got more experience, then you could do more. And of course, this also depends on how big the franchise offering is. If you're someone who is, for example, CASA, who is franchising a whole sort of senior care package, the investment's quite high, about $1 million per franchisee, whereas for Tender, it's a far smaller ask. And then you're ready to scale, which is the rapid rollout of replications. But really, this is almost like one pilot after the next. You might bring on 10 franchisees, then you might bring on 20, and keep going. And of course, you can keep it to England, Scotland, or you might want to franchise globally as well. Okay, so that's a bit about the how. Let's move on to some of the barriers or what might get in the way. So we did some research with Big Lottery Fund, which is on our website in the resources section as well. And we surveyed about 150 organizations, interviewed 30. And these were the 4 key barriers, and I'm sure that some will speak to you. So the key reasons why people found franchising difficult was A, access to finance. So as you can probably tell, it's quite a lot of work actually to set up your franchise right before you do it, and that costs money. And that is one of the significant barriers to franchising. It's time, it's your internal capacity to make sure you can do that, and the finances as well up front. The payoff is that in the long run, it's far, far quicker to scale up because you've got a systemized package. Number 2 is lack of expert support. So, and that was, this is one of the things that spurred us on to create ICSF. While a lot of this stuff isn't rocket science at all, if you've never done this before, it's quite possible you can do things in the early days like set up the finances wrong, or set up the relationship between your franchisees slightly wrong, so that the cracks really start to show in year 2 and 3 and 4. So it's quite important to have someone who has some experience of scaling replication to at least cast quite a detailed eye over the plans. Finding suitable partners and franchisees people find challenging, depending on the sector. And that's why at the systemized phase we sort of advocate working out quite carefully what your recruitment plan is. Now, of course, if you can't find franchisees, then you can't franchise, and that's why that is one of the key 10 questions on our franchise readiness test. And then finally, a lack of skills, capacity internally is a real killer here. And we've found the organizations we've worked with that are franchising best are the ones who are relatively secure. Organizations who are going through financial problems with the sort of core of their organization, it's probably not the best time to think about really growing significantly. Franchising doesn't bring in lots of money early on necessarily. Franchising is a long-term solution where people pay or bring in money over time. So it's not going to sort out short-term problems. In fact, it might exacerbate them if you try to franchise too early. And then the making it work. So what would we, sort of the top 4 things we suggest you do or make sure you're doing before you embark upon this. Number 1, make sure it's proven. Make sure the model is fairly locked down, you've tested it a number of times, it hopefully has some evaluation attached to it. The second is systemize it, create those systems and processes. Choosing the right franchisee cannot be overestimated, the importance of this. I mean, really when it comes down to this, if you choose the right franchisee, even if you systemize slightly wrong or things change, you can make it work. Organizations we've seen who've picked the wrong franchisee, the wrong set of skills, you can have the most perfect franchise offering, but the relationship doesn't work. So really spending time choosing the right franchisee, but then also giving them that training and support, ongoing support that they need to really make that role work. And really franchising has been called a sort of marriage. It's a relationship between franchisor and franchisee. And while you get the benefit of scale, that can be a fraught relationship if it's not thought out carefully. Okay, I'm coming to the end. So then there's the are you ready to replicate? I'm not going to go into any detail, although we've got time in questions if you do want me to talk a bit more about that. But really I would recommend as next steps for you, take the 10-question test. It's a very simple thing on our website. You should also know that we've been funded by Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany to develop a toolkit, a social franchising toolkit. Now that unfortunately won't be published till about February or March next year, but we're really putting all our intellectual property that we've learnt so far out there so that people like yourself who are considering this can go through the steps more independently. And just an open offer, do feel free to contact me. My email address is there. Very happy to have a brief conversation with with anyone about your situation and what may work and next steps. And of course, we're set up to partner with organizations to help them scale up. So always happy to discuss some kind of partnership to help you scale up more effectively. So I think that probably concludes my presentation, and I don't know if we have any questions or not.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Really, really, really helpful, and already got a couple of questions are coming through, by the way.
Good.
So yes, please, if you have a question, please type it in the chat function. Unfortunately, we haven't quite got the technology working in that we could unmute the participants and get you actually speaking to Dan. But if you want to type in a question, I will try and cover as many as possible. And if we run out of time, we've got until 1, then I'll make sure I'll pass on your question to Dan, and he's really kindly offered to address questions afterwards as well. So hopefully we get everything covered. So let's go straight in with the first one, and it's around finance. And you mentioned that was one of the biggest barriers to replicating or franchising. The question is, which organizations, which organizations will finance social franchisors, franchisees? Are there organizations who would help with the finance?
Sorry, who will finance franchisors and franchisors?
Yeah, either or.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So on the franchisee side, so that's the money to get replication ready in the first place. What we've found is that organizations are often going back to the donors or the funders or investors that are closest to them when they can tell a really sort of exciting story about the potential for franchising. Tender went back to Big Lottery. One of our other clients has gone back to the Trussell Trust, who supported them with some grants. So that's on the grant side. I think there's also some potential within some of the funds that the social investment business run, although we haven't worked with any of those specifically. I think there's a couple of interesting ones there. And you should just know that I think there's an insufficient amount of funding directed specifically at this, and I'm working quite hard with Big Lottery and a few other funders to create a fund around social franchising specifically. But I have been doing that for 2 years now. It's looking increasingly likely that it will happen. But I was promising people a year ago it wouldn't take more than 2 years ago it wouldn't take more than a year. So no promises on that one, I'm afraid, and don't hold your breath. But it is something that we're working hard on. Franchisees is a bit of a sort of difficult question at this stage because it really does depend on the sector you're working in. You know, in Food Bank's case, it's small amounts of money, and therefore the fact that they're in churches meant that actually a lot of it could come from the congregants in the churches or local funders. The community foundations are a great local funder, and it's difficult to get the community foundation money if you're a big central organisation. So that might unlock some local money. And then, of course, someone like the School for Social Entrepreneurs got that Lloyd's and Big Lottery money, and then the franchisees are fundraising locally from local donors and others. I think people like Esme Fairburn and some of the sort of the usual suspects may be interested as well. Just to give you an idea of the kind of costs, it's a bit difficult to say with any accuracy. But really, we'd recommend that if you're going through this whole systemized phase and running it, you need somebody at least sort of 3 days a week or so while they're systemizing, depending on the amount of work. And really, by the time you set up your franchise, ideally you've got someone working on your team with pretty much full-time capacity, 3 days a week at the very least, to do this. So you do need that space. And then in addition, if you bring in outside people, you'll have to budget for that. That's very variable, anything between $5,000 and 20, 25 grand, something like that. So it's not inexpensive, although I'd say it's worth it in terms of scale, I realise this is a key barrier. You know, you've got to do the fundraising up front to make that happen. I hope that answers.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Dan. Hopefully that did answer the question for the person who was asking that. Now, then the next question. Have you worked with any businesses that are capital intensive to set up? Are there any good case studies we could look at?
Capital intensive businesses. Yeah, I mean, CASA, who I mentioned, are worth having a look at. As I said, they're about $1 million they need to raise for each franchisee. If your model is quite close to the commercial sector, then as in you'd be able to charge a fee to your franchisees and you've got something which is generating profit which you can split between them and you, then of course there are loads of examples from the commercial sector that will, probably 80–90% be relevant. I think probably the best thing there is because it depends what you mean by capital intensive too. I mean, even the NSPCC who we're working with, their franchisees will need to pay about 20 grand or something like that, but it's mainly local authorities actually who are doing that. So that's fairly intensive, but if you're talking, $500,000 something, that's obviously different. So very happy if you just shoot me an email after this and just outline a little bit more about exactly what you need, then I'm happy to do a bit of digging and find something which is sort of right specifically for you.
Great, thank you, Dan. Hopefully, Kate, you got that and can either follow up with Dan or that in itself was helpful. So let's go to the next one. What would you advise? We've started running pilots of franchising without a great system in place and are now seeing huge demand to really roll out franchising quickly. I'm thinking we should probably pause and come up with a better system and then roll out franchising. So did you get that question? It's sort of
yes,
what would your
yes.
advice be? There's suddenly
Yes.
a lot of demand, but they don't quite have a system in place.
No, definitely. I mean, I think your instinct is absolutely right to take a pause, but while at the same time completely acknowledging that there's pressure from inside the organisation, from outside, and of course you don't want that pause to be too long and you don't want to miss opportunities. I mean, maybe if I just give you an example, because Tender, who I mentioned to you, the arts organisation, we're in exactly in the same situation. I don't know your exact similar situation. So Tender had got a grant from Big Lottery to roll out to 4 sites, and similarly didn't systematize their processes that effectively, and was starting to see the relationship fraying and cracking in some cases. They went out to a couple of donors and said, look, we want to go through the process of really systemizing before we embark upon expanding. And it's only taken, so creating the design phase with them took probably 3 months, and then the systemized phase, the nice thing about that is you can overlap, if you're doing it carefully, you can overlap the recruitment of new franchisees and the systemized phase together, which saves on time. So you can do that in sort of 3 to 6 months as well, obviously depending on how many systems need to be created. But if you were to do that, I would really, and do things simultaneously, I'd really advise speaking to someone, maybe you've got someone on your board who's got experience of doing this. I'm happy to have a conversation because, of course, if you overestimate or underestimate the amount of time needed to systemize, and then suddenly you've got these 4 or 5 franchisees on your back saying, where's all our material, that can create serious strain. So I would really advocate waiting or pausing until you have everything sort of in your back pocket and you're ready to go, but also totally recognise that pragmatic solutions are needed, and we need to make this thing happen as well.
Great, thank you, Dan. Johnny, hope that was helpful on your question. Then we had another one. Oh, okay, interesting one. Why would someone pay for a franchise when they cannot personally benefit from the profits, as the profits will have to go back into the community? Why would someone pay for a franchise when they cannot personally benefit from the profits, as the profits have to go back into the community?
Sure. So I suppose the first thing, I mean, I'm just reflecting now, most of the examples I've used that actually are sort of ones that need grants. So social franchises can be far more commercial in nature. We've just done some work with the Ethical Property Company, which is, they run buildings, ethical buildings. They are generating a profit. It's a social enterprise. It's very similar to sort of commercial arrangement. So sort of just reading into the question, there's no reason why a franchisee can't gain financially from the relationship and set it up as a social enterprise and be a limited company. However, if you are working on the more sort of social end of the social franchising spectrum and the food bank, I mean, what we've found, it's quite amazing, really, that so many people want to create change in their local community, and there's so much more than the money for people doing things. Even when I was in McDonald's, those guys are not in it just to make money. They honestly, you're going to have to believe me on this one, there is a real community feel about what they do. They strive for excellence. They take pride in their work. And of course, you think that even more in the case in a sort of social franchise situation. So take a food bank. Those are mainly churches, as I mentioned, who are the franchisees. These guys are, inspired by Scripture. They really, really want to help people make a difference. And it's not about the money going back. It's about just being able to be as effective as they can in their local community. So there's something here about finding out whether there are enough critical mass of those sort of people who want to create change, but they may not be as motivated by the financials, and seeing whether they'll come on board. And I mean, I wrote a blog recently, you can see in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, on the huge potential of harnessing those people who are not sort of entrepreneurial, not the social entrepreneurs of the community who want to set it up themselves, but harnessing those people who do want to create change, are good people, but don't necessarily know how to set up a food bank. They don't know what the governance arrangements, and to be honest, they don't care. They just want to go out and help people. So I think there's a huge potential in social franchising for finding those right people and bringing them on board as franchisees. The key is making sure that your assumptions are right, and there's something about just common sense here. If someone is being expected to work 4 days a week to create a food bank for no money, then you start to think, actually there probably aren't that many people who would do that. Whereas if it was a day a week or half a day a week, then that's more viable. And in fact, with the food bank, if it is 4 day a week, maybe part of the model is they have to raise a bit of their salary locally. So I think the common sense test is a really important one, and just putting yourselves in the shoes of your potential franchisee and just making sure it makes sense.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got at least two more questions, and we'll see where we are after that. So, hi, I run 2 small local charities, and if we expand again, we will then need to bind them together, their values, their methods, etc. Both through the systems and the way things are done, but also through legal methods. Which company type, legal structure is best for an umbrella organization, mothership, to hold this franchise in sort of inverted commas?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I think the challenge here, and we saw this in our research for Big Lottery, is that there really isn't a generic answer for this. It really does depend on the model you're using. So, for example, ICSF, my organization, is a registered charity. We've decided to be a registered charity because we want to stay absolutely dedicated to our social aims. but yet, we could quite easily be a limited company, I think, and still do similar sorts of things. And that was a sort of, I suppose, an ethical choice for us. And therefore, when we've replicated and recently opened an office in America, we wanted that to be a registered charity, a 501c3 out there, 501c3 organization out there. Whereas once again, it probably could have been a limited company or something similar. So there isn't really a one-size-fits-all answer, I'm afraid, for that one. And one, I'd be happy to have a quick chat about if it would be helpful. I suppose the important thing here, where you would need sort of legal advice, and I would definitely recommend speaking to a lawyer around this question, is often people find it quite useful to split the franchise network into a separate subsidiary, so that it's its own entity and it's clear who the franchisees are licensing to, as it were. But that's not always necessary in the social sector. So I'm not sure I've been particularly helpful, other than to say this needs quite a bit of thought around your specific model, and that's what we do at the design phase of this process normally.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So Alex and Johnny, hopefully that will at least give you some sort of food for thought, and then maybe you can follow up directly with Dan on that, or a lawyer, if that's what you need.
Just on the legal side of things, Marika, I
Sure.
don't know if people know, but we've found Trust Law Connect, who are run by the Thomson Reuters Foundation. They provide pro bono lawyers, and if you don't know them, it might be worth signing up. It's a bit of a sort of pain from the admin perspective, but very worthwhile if you can get some free support there. Otherwise, if you do need a franchise agreement done specifically, we would normally advise going for people who do this day in, day out, and that we've got a really fantastic lawyer we've used a number of times who charges a reduced rate of around about £3,000 or even less for a social franchise. So happy to let you know who they are too, if that's helpful.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. How much information do you recommend sharing upfront to attract franchisees without giving away too much of your IP? At what stage would you recommend bringing in legal agreements or things like that?
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. So generally how recruitment works is you would create your prospectus, put your advert out for franchisees, and then you create your prospectus. And your prospectus is normally around a 6 to 8 page document, and I can see, if you want, I can try dig out an example or two of that, although there'll be in our toolkit when it's ready. And the prospectus needs to cover all of the key elements that the franchisee needs to consider when they're making a decision. So that includes, the finances. Maybe you could be pretty honest about some of the the benefits and challenges they may face. I suppose it's more helpful to look at the purpose of that document, and the purpose of that document is to make sure when your franchisee, when they contact you and apply for it, they fully understand, or maybe not fully, but have a pretty good idea of what they're getting themselves into. And that does a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it saves you a huge amount of time from having to speak to lots of people. It means you're not having a conversation where you speak for an hour and then say, oh, by the way, it's £20,000 to become a franchisee, and they say, oh, not interested. It's just all there up front. It does that and just sort of sifts out the right people. So that would be the first stage, the prospectus. Once they've received that prospectus, we'd recommend doing a discovery day. So it's a day, or maybe half a day, where you bring all your prospective franchisees together. We did this when we were working with Food Cycle and Nesta. At the Nesta office, we invited about 20 prospective franchisees, and we spent a few hours going through how it all works, what you can expect, and then really it's the applications. So the applications come through, and then once you've chosen, you want to get that's basically when you want to get them to sign up to the legal agreement before you give them any additional detailed manuals and things like that. You might want to give them, they pay a deposit at that point as well. So maybe not the whole fee, but a deposit to make sure that they're seriously brought into this before you sort of show them all of your IP, because then you're protected. So I think a process like that is really important to make sure people don't just get it and then say, hey, I can do this myself, and run off with it.
Great, thank you. And just one more final question, because we are nearly at 1 o'clock. Does your organisation, Dan, do you charge for helping a social entrepreneur set up a social franchise? And if so, what sort of costs are we talking about? So if you're happy to discuss that on the webinar, please do. If you don't, I can connect you directly with the person who's asking the question.
No, sure, yes. No, we do charge. Sadly, the money has to come from somewhere. So how it normally works with us when we're partnering with someone is either the organisation has the finance themselves, which normally doesn't happen for smaller charities or social enterprise. That's for people we've done work with, Nike Foundation and things like that. They've got some finance. So normally how it would work is that we'd have a conversation with a person who wants to embark upon a project, and together we develop a proposal, and that proposal could then be taken to funders, grant funders or investment funders, that kind of thing, and we'd raise the money. And of course we're happy to sort of give a few ideas of the sorts of funders that might be interested in that. But normally it is the organisation's existing donors who are most interested. I should also say that if you're doing a bigger proposal, say for expanding to 4 new sites, then I definitely recommend putting in a bit of that support as a sort of corner, a small corner of that proposal, in which case it's always more palatable to funders. The sort of amounts of money we're talking about, so when we have our toolkit up and running, I think we'll be able to reduce our costs. But to give you an idea of the full process, if it's absolutely standard going through the first sort of 2 stages, design and systemize, we're talking in the region of around 20, 25, maybe up to £30,000, something in that region if it's a small enterprise and it's one project. But obviously there are different ways to do things, so I'm just putting a number out there, but really the reason we've been set up as a charity is that we want to work with people to make it work for them within what's reasonable. So if you're interested, I think the easiest thing is just to have a conversation, and I can send you a bit more information as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Now that was our last question, so we've gone through most, and if anyone's still got some questions, then please do just contact Dan directly. Just a big massive thank you, and people are putting thank yous also through the chat function, which is nice. So I think people have found it really useful. So thank you so much, Dan, for your time. Really appreciate you giving up an hour, your lunch break, to be with us. Dan, are you okay? We've recorded the webinar, by the way, so you will get the recording together with the slides as part of the webinar. But are you okay, Dan, for me to send the slides separately as well as a PowerPoint? Yeah. Fine, great. No problem. You can flick through those at your own time if you don't want to re-listen to all of the content. So those will come through. So a big thank you from me. I will send, as I said, I'll send a follow-up email to everyone, also to those who registered but couldn't listen live, with the recording, with the slides, with all the relevant links. And yeah, our next webinar is on Thursday, which will be on social value. I will send you the link on how to register for that as well, if that feels relevant, and links to all the future webinars. So unless, Dan, you have any final words?
Well, just to thank you for coming, and to reiterate the offer of having a chat with anyone who's thinking through this. I find it endlessly interesting, so I'd love to have a conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone, and have a really great rest of the day. Thanks.